All right. Thanks anyone who's watching in the future at this point, because there's no one in the chat room yet. But this is the Jerb the Humanist channel on YouTube. As a reminder, I do have a podcast feed that I upload this audio to. So you are welcome to go into your podcast provider and look up Jerb the Humanist, and you should find that. I just don't have any video essays on my podcast feed because that's just for the visual medium. But I'm really excited today to talk to my guest. It's Toby Buckle. He's the host of the Political Philosophy podcast. Welcome onto my channel, Toby.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and you have an admirable background. You have a background working for a variety of progressive groups. You had kind of a list on your website, and right now you're working for Amnesty International.
I actually left Amnesty. I need to update my bio. I actually left Amnesty about 6 months ago, and I'm with World Animal Protection now. But yeah, like you say, I'm a Brit living in the States, and I spent about 8 years, and I've done like a host of different progressive causes, as well as work for some Democrats.
That's very good. So you do have a background in social justice, which is good for us to talk about today. Some things I have in mind. Maybe we'll get into a bit of disagreement, hopefully, because I think that makes good audio. But I do want to say I've been really enjoying your podcast, and to blow smoke up your ass a little bit, I will say one of the things I do like about some of the discussions you have is you have kind of a transparency to your attitude. For those who haven't listened to that podcast, you do have who's the Glenn? You have Glenn Rout. You had Glenn Lowry on one. More or less conservative economist, well, neoliberal economist, I suppose, but with more conservative race.
I think Glenn would be happy with the label conservative.
Yeah, well, he said so on your episode. So, but and you had a very good faith discussion with him, but also you have. You had the existential comics writer, Corey, what is it? How do you pronounce it?
Corey Moeller, I think.
Moeller, yeah. And he absolutely identifies as a communist propagandist. So, like, I think that's great. And there was around the time of, the 2016 election, there was sort of a quasi valuation, like there was a very strong liberal talking point that we need to engage with people of all sides, and we need to reach out to the Trump voter and see all kinds of perspectives. And in some senses, I agree with that. In some senses I don't, but it seemed like that was a lot of the time that was centrist Democrats who would not talk to people further left, and by reach out to the other side, it was a lot of the time like very right-wing views. Does that sound like it comports with your view, I suppose?
Yeah, so yeah, and I think that's right. And I think one of the great ironies and the frustrations I have with a lot of public discourse and a lot of the way so-called public intellectuals, I'll call them public intellectuals, but public intellectuals in the intellectual dark web and stuff like this carry on, is the people who are calling loudest for free speech and open discourse and tolerating and conversing with views that you might find objectionable. They put a very hard barrier when it comes up to, even to my mind, very sensible mainstream social democratic views, basically anything that takes an overtly leftist position on social justice. They are really just refuse to engage with it in good faith. And I'll just say how I do this is I just play it by ear. I'm not quite someone who says I'll talk to anybody. I'm not quite there. I have some liberal friends who won't talk to anybody outside their particular milieu, but I just sort of play it by someone who was willing to engage with me in good faith, whereas I probably would not want to have a conversation with someone like, say, Milo Yiannopoulos or Candace Owens or those sorts of people, because I just get the feeling that they're not operating in good faith. So I think it's a judgment call. I think certainly a lot of people on the left are way too restrictive. I'll have conversations with conservatives. But I don't think that's just a carte blanche for you have to talk to anybody and you have to tolerate anybody, no matter how bigoted or unethical. So that's sort of how I approach that.
Yeah. Do you think there are reasons for that cutoff beyond very strong cynical reasons? Because it's very easy to say something about that, like with Dave Rubin. He's funded by the Institute of Humane Studies, and Charles Koch is a board member. Like, there's a very clear line of where his incentives come from. But I think even like smaller YouTube channels that aren't bathing in Koch money have a similar cutoff. Like, is that just ideology that's doing that, or what?
Well, I mean, we can maybe talk about ideology. As you know, I have a very expansive definition of what ideology is. So I think it's a few things. It's, firstly, like you say, it's the power of incentives. What's the old quote? Like, it's hard to get a man to believe something if his salary depends on him not believing it. And certainly with Rubin, that seems to be the case. And I've no problem saying that I find Dave Rubin to be a complete hack at this point, right? With that said, I think there's also a thing where we all just need to get thicker skins. I include the left on that, but I include the right on that more. So I think there's a thing on the left where we say, anyone, I'll tolerate disagreement, but anyone who challenges my fundamental identity, that's my cutoff point, which sounds good, except that in practice means any conservative view on social justice that you disagree with is going to be outside of the box for you. Now, on the right, they'll say, I'll tolerate anyone who's willing to operate in good faith with me, but as soon as you call them a racist or a sexist or a homophobe, or you even imply it, that is the end of the conversation for them. And I'm sorry, like, if you are going to talk about race in public, you are going to get called a racist, right? And that, to my mind, is just a cost. So I'd like to see a thickening of skins. I would like to see liberals stay in the conversation with people who we think hold bigoted views. But I think much more than that, conservatives need to stop getting, I don't know if we can curse on this show, but need to stop getting stop getting so fucking butthurt whenever someone says you might be a misogynist or you might be a sexist. One, you might be, and two, if that's wrong, explain to them why it's wrong. Don't just chicken out and run for the hills and go, oh my God, they called me a racist. Like,
right.
To use some misogynistic language, man up, like, have that conversation.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to like more left causes, there is nuance, and maybe you'll agree with this, but I think a lot of that attitude from progressive people stems from just an exhaustion of, more op-eds in the New York Times about how we need to reach out to Nazis or something like that.
Right.
And like very little, like it's manufacturing consent levels of why people don't discuss these things, and that's very frustrating. But that's very centralized around institutions of power and dissemination of information. There is kind of a little censorious or even like complete inability to reach out on the left that I am frustrated with, because I do think if you are good at representing the left and, you know, dealing well with somebody else's conversation, if somebody else, like if it were me, but someone who's articulate and who can think on their feet, you know, I would go on to like Sargon of Akkad's channel or something like that, or something like Ben Shapiro or something, just to like, that gives visibility to someone else. And that is something the left is bad about, but I think sometimes it's
You'll also find though that those people aren't very interested in having left on their show. So there's that. Like they famously won't do it. Despite
their I'll debate anyone, you know.
But that applies to people further rightwards than themselves. It doesn't apply at all to the left.
Right. There is kind of a gradient. I guess there is also the notion, like, I mean, when it does come to social justice, you know, if you even put on the conversation about, you know, are these trans questions up for grabs, that does put into question people's like humanity and things like that. Like I would not go on Ben Shapiro's show, like, and again, with the caveat that he wouldn't invite me on, I would not go on to debate if like Black people are inherently violent as a culture or something like that. Like,
I mean, I might disagree. Like, I've engaged publicly on the debate of the Black IQ thing, which I would argue is a fundamental invalidation of people's humanity. I mean, I honestly believe the sort of Charles Murray thesis that Black people are genetically less intelligent. I think in 100 years that's going to be up on the shelf with phrenology. But I've engaged publicly on that one. And like, I think there's like, in a perfect world, would we have to debate these ideas? No. In the world that we live in, do we have to debate them? Yes. And as far as the trans one goes, I understand if in the moment an individual, particularly an individual trans person, doesn't have the emotional energy to engage with someone who's just trying to get a rise out of them. Of course, at an individual level, people are completely justified in wanting to back out of those conversations. On a societal level, we're in an ideological fight and we have to win it. And if we don't win it, the other side will win it. And, you know, you can argue like if a particular engagement is strategic or not. But no, I mean, I think we're not going to win by not fighting.
Yeah, I mean, I do think there are other ways of fighting. And I guess part of the problem is, you know, and actually I would be willing to have like a one-on-one conversation with pretty much anyone about those issues, because part of, I guess, what people are scared of is like a giant debate where the framing is completely off. Like, you know, like maybe even like if a conservative listens to one of these debates and like a trans person goes on, you know, he might actually change his mind. Like the listeners or the audience members might change their mind. And I'm totally willing. I think that does happen to some extent, but then to everyone else, they see a debate like are trans people, like, I don't know, do they deserve rights, like, or something like, I don't know,
women, you know, something like that.
Yeah, right. And so like that just emphasizes the degree to which, like, you know, it is kind of a dehumanizing framing, if you will, you know.
Yeah, no doubt. And that is the framing that's been forced upon us. And I mean, I always say I'm more interested in having discussions than having debates. And I would and yet to ever really do a public debate on any of this stuff, because even with like Glenn Lowry, I would phrase that more as a discussion. I'm always open to have good faith discussions, and like you say, I try to be as transparent of where I'm coming from, why I believe what I believe, and why I think I can claim knowledge in particular areas and not in others. A debate, you're there to win and you're there to score points. And in that case, I think it comes down to strategy. Is this a debate? Is like, if you've got an army, where are you going to pitch your battle? Like, are you likely to win or not? Are you likely to make followers or lose them? And that is what it is. And I agree, debates probably aren't the best weapon in the ideological battle, but I think we can't say that we're never going to do them ever on our side. You as an individual or me as an individual might not be the best person to do them, but we do. We can't just surrender the field uniformly, I think.
Yeah. Well, I think you made a point that I was going to raise, so I don't think I need to spend too much time on it, but I am also cynical of, you know, the idea that everything has to be a debate. Like, that just doesn't solve things like on a mass level. There's like actual movements and work, I think, that does a lot more than just having a discussion on Bill Maher or X program, even something way more progressive than that. But, you know, that's just my opinion. So
yeah, it's certainly not all there is to it, and or the most important thing. But
yeah,
I think there's some leftists who say we should never do it at all, and that strikes me as a little self-defeating. But yeah,
well, I think visibility is good, if that makes sense. Like, I think when it comes to these social justice issues, a lot of it is, you know, bringing you know, these people and their experiences to the forefront, and we can be cynical about, like, you know, reasons why those aren't popular narratives, you know, maybe published in the New York Times and the op-eds, but like, I think that the evidence, like a lot of the papers that I've read on like changing minds, the evidence tends to show that people really change because, you know, their cousin came out as gay or something like that. So
it's actually even starker than that. A 20-minute conversation with a gay person has been shown to have significant impacts on people's social views, and impacts that maintain over time. So yeah, I mean, we know for 40 years now, since the civil rights movement, we sort of know what the solution is to overt bigotry, and by and large it isn't debates, though I don't think we should just run from them, but it's integration. It's integrating across the black-white divide. It's integrating our workplaces so that, you know, women are in the workplace at all levels. It's knowing gay people personally, or trans people personally, or even just seeing them on TV. It's why, and I think this is almost like proven now, it's why universities make people so much more liberal. It's not that you've got a bunch of Marxists on college, which, I mean, you do, but like, why does doing an engineering degree make you more liberal, which it does? And the answer is because, you know, if you go to a college campus of any size, you're going to meet people of different demographic backgrounds to you, and that makes you more liberal. So yes, absolutely. And it's why I'm a strong integrationalist, which some people on the far left are not, unfortunately. But yeah, we know that that's the solution. But anyway, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, that ties in to some of your work that you're doing. Your podcast has recently, at least you've started a series on the history of libertarianism. It's not just about libertarianism, it's about ideology, liberalism. And I do think it's very interesting. And in between, you do have you have 2 episodes on Wittgenstein, which are actually very nicely placed, because that's
that
around.
Well, didn't it? I didn't plan that at all, but it worked out. It worked out well.
Yeah. Well, you know, you had your initial episode on sort of that split right at the beginning. Let me put this in biology. The universe, they're the common ancestors between liberalism and libertarianism. And then you did 2 episodes on Wittgenstein, and then the next one was on how language, how so much of politics is a debate over language. And I was like, wow, I'm glad he talked about Wittgenstein right before this, because this totally clarifies for everything. So, but by the way, are you pulling a lot of that from your own philosophy background, or like is that, or have you just put a shit ton of research into that project?
I've put some research into that project, certainly. My own philosophy, I mean, I did a degree in it ages ago, but I'm not an academic philosopher, so I haven't really touched that in a while. I read this stuff out of interest, and in terms of where I'm drawing from there, I'm drawing from Michael Freedom, who I've had on my show, and I was taught by him way back in the day. And he is a philosopher who thinks very, very linguistically about how politics works.
Yeah, and it really pulls away the curtain sometimes. I don't know if you use that analogy, but I think, I guess the default position, if this makes sense, in a lot of discourse is assumptions of linguistic prescriptivism. You know, like if the dictionary says X, then X, you know, and that's just not how it works. You know, dictionaries, you know, pull from common usage and they follow human usage. I'm not exactly sure. I've always seen it framed as prescriptivism versus descriptivism. I'm not sure how Wittgenstein fits into that framework, except to say that he's definitely not prescriptivist. But, you know.
Yeah, so I think, you know, you can get tongue-tied on language and what the exact terms are. As I just said, I'm not a professional academic philosopher, so I'm not going to go, well, this is what exactly this term means or that term means. What it really comes down to is, do words have like this essence, this like meaning that's sort of like the word, but sort of different from the word? So like Plato believed there's like this form up in the clouds, this perfect, for every cow there's like a perfect representation of what a cow is. Or is it the case that words are sort of a set of common recurring themes that to take the analogy Wittgenstein uses, games tend to be competitive, but they're not always. Games tend to involve some sort of physical activity, but they're not always. They tend to be played for fun, but they're not always. And all a game is sort of something that just ticks like 5 out of 7 of the boxes. And there's no point at which you can nail it down and say a game is exactly this. Wittgenstein tells us, don't think, but look. Stop trying to go, oh, if I really work it out, I'll get to the bottom of what this word means. Look, like you say, at the actual usage. Look at how people actually use the word. That's what it means.
Right. And so that's totally just describing how audiences and people in dialogue just use any given word as a tool. And that really upsets people, because I think pedantry is a really easy game to play to dunk on people, I guess. But it totally does illustrate why there's a lot of political tension, because we're not even using the same tools the same way when communicating. Even like a centrist, if they think of socialism, that's sort of just like the government does stuff, government services, right. That's socialism. And if you're around left book and you even some places, if you call Bernie Sanders a socialist, which he calls himself a socialist, they'll like, chew you out because Bernie Sanders doesn't want the workers to own the means of production. So like like there's not even two like we're not even framing everything in a way that allows for like effective communication between us.
Yeah, there's sort of a danger though when you say effective communication is that can lead you to sort of slip back into this like essentialist trap.
Right.
Like, there's this idea that if we could, and this is actually what animates all of political ideology, if we could all just get down to it and really agree that this word means this and this word means this, then we could have a proper conversation with each other. And the reality is we're never going to. Like, politics and political ideology by its nature is competitions over the control of political language. And these competitions, so what are ideologies trying to do? Ideologies are trying to say, this is what socialism means. This is what moderation means. This is what freedom, justice, fairness, this is what all these words mean. And ideologies, for them, winning would be having everyone, whether it's the elites or the public, agree with a particular conception of those words. But that's chimerial. Politics, by its nature, is the quest for certainty that will be, you'll even you can see this in practical politics. You have elections, referendums, whatever, and they're meant to be final. But then that unravels again. And you have to go back and back in search of that certainty. And it's the same way linguistically. People are never going to agree what socialism means. People are never going to agree what freedom and justice and fairness mean. And not only is that okay, but it's inescapable. And in some ways, it's very desirable.
Yeah, well, yeah, so that is a good word. Freedom, you just brought that up.
Right.
That's a very good example because everyone has their own conception of freedom. Well, that's a bit trite as a description of the word, but I ended up debating a libertarian just one-on-one. Like I actually just brought up the concept of, I guess, positive and negative liberty. And for, just, you probably know this, but, for listeners, I'm referring to, negative liberty. Nobody has or authorities or other people don't have the ability to impose power upon you. And positive liberty is your own ability or the system allows you to accomplish how would you phrase it?
So here's the trick with positive and negative.
Okay.
Negative is actually quite neat. And by the way, libertarians don't have a negative conception of freedom. They think they do, but they don't.
Okay. Yeah.
But negative liberty is quite tightly defined, and you can do it very easily as the absence of deliberate interpersonal constraints.
Yes, that makes sense.
Right. Positive liberty is sort of an umbrella term covering everything else. Right. So just to go through this quickly, negative liberty is someone like Thomas Hobbes. To the extent that the action is uninterfered with, it is free, right? Positive liberty, you could have democratic freedom. You could have, the idea that if I'm in a system where I can vote for my representatives, I'm free. You could have autonomous freedom to the extent that I'm thinking about and actively choice making. I'm free. You could have stoic freedom to the extent I reconcile myself with the world. You can have economic freedom. So all of these are different positive ideas of freedom, which don't really boil down to a single thing. And just to finish the point, libertarian freedom, which is sort of quite similar to economic freedom, right? That's not a negative conception of freedom because it only counts as deliberate interpersonal constraints. things that libertarians don't like. So if the state tells you you can't do something, then that's a restriction on your negative freedom that libertarians care about. But if a private corporation says you can't cross this land because it's privately owned, a negative conception of freedom says that your freedom is constricted, but a libertarian doesn't. So it's actually a positive conception of freedom. It's a conception that that certain forms of property rights, corporations can restrict you without interfering with your freedom, and governments can't. So it's not a purely negative conception.
Right.
And then I could talk about
mention, like, the state has to, well, if you own property, you'll need an entity like the state to enforce that you own that property.
And if you want to go one level behind that, if you want people to believe that property is the most important right in a society and it's understood as exclusive individual control of a good, you're going to have a very active a program of state interference to make people believe that. Because people don't naturally believe that. That's something profoundly unintelligible to most human beings who've ever lived. Doesn't mean they're right or we're right. It just means that that is an artificial belief, not a natural one.
Right. And yeah, and that sort of, I'll be honest, that sort of sacrosanct property right, that just really, I don't even know if that counts as deontology, but that has turned me off of deontology like forever, just because it's such a, like, I just find it such a shitty deontology that the most fundamental right is property. That's just.
So you can justify it deontologically, or you can justify it in terms of a moral consequentialism.
Right.
What's quite annoying about libertarians is they tend to jump back and forth from one to the other without much conception that that's what they're doing. So they'll say, you don't have the right to interfere with my property, and then you'll make a point about ethics, and then they'll say, yeah, but that'll just lead to the economy crashing, and then you say, well, actually it won't because of this, that, and the other, and they'll jump back to ethics again. So you're constantly sort of playing philosophical whack-a-mole. Now I
think everyone does that, though. Like, I mean, except for, like, you know, people well versed in political philosophy. Like, I think even I will use deontological language, because a lot of the time that's a very compelling way to make a point. Like, in terms of abortion, I think expressing bodily autonomy is like that right. That's easier to go through than, like, explain the consequences of, like, every possible thing that can go wrong once you're pregnant and something else is developing inside of you, you know.
Well, I mean, and, you know, you could go down this whole, there's, like, rule and act consequentialism, right? You can defend a rule on its own merits, more or less, without abandoning a consequentialist framework. I mean, here's the thing, though. Even if one accepts deontology as a starting point, which I don't, then I'm still not particularly convinced that libertarianism is a great answer. So here's why. You can assert anything as a freestanding deantic constraint, right? So you can say, you just can't interfere with people's property. Great. That is one contender for a deantic constraint. You can say people have a right to welfare. People have a right to healthcare. That could be a freestanding deantic constraint. You could say, any power exercised over you must be accountable to you. That could be a standing deantic constraint. And you could go on. We could probably between us list 100 of them, right?
Right.
Now, those, you can't have them all at once because they're incompatible with each other. At the very least, you'll have to start prioritizing and saying, when property rights and welfare conflict, this is how we resolve that conflict. And what's weird about libertarianism is how unsophisticated its deontology is. It just says property rights trump, you'll excuse the word, trump all other conceivable deantic constraints. Why? because fuck you, we just told you why. And if you start running down the list, it's like, can we tax a billionaire to provide life-saving surgery to a poor person? Why not? Why was that right override the right to life? What about limited and accountable power? You know, we can't vote Mark Zuckerberg out of office. Is that not a deantic constraint that we might care about? What about social bonds? What about the ability of a society to democratically decide its future? The deontologist isn't just committed to stipulating that deantic constraint. They're stipulated to saying it overrides any other deantic constraint. And I've just never seen what the argument for that is.
Yeah, well, that just might be fallout from Rand not being very good at philosophy. But
even someone like Robert Nozick, right? State Anarchy and Utopia, who's supposedly the great genius of libertarianism, and he's just like a sophisticated thinker up there with John Rawls or something. What's he got? He starts State Anarchy Utopia by saying people, and I'm quoting here, people have rights, and so far-reaching are those rights that it raises the question of what, if anything, governments can do to them. Cool, good start. But what does he mean by rights? He just means individual property rights, understood in a certain way. And what's his great philosophical argument for those rights overwhelming any other sorts of rights? Just a fucking, oh, I'm so sorry, just a single-minded appeal to intuition. Just I find it counterintuitive. I find it counterintuitive that we can't tax billionaires to give people healthcare. This is not sophisticated philosophy.
Yeah, well, that's I don't think you're being objective, Toby. This is objectivism. Like there is that language.
So let's be objective, you know.
Yeah.
Let's assume objectivism. Let's assume deontology. Now we have no good reason to assume either of those things, but I'll play in their court. Let's assume both of those things. Let's assume that there are freestanding moral rules which can be objectively known, right? How do we establish what those rules are? If your argument is an appeal to intuition, then all you've got is your intuition, and your intuition actually isn't that commonly shared. I have an intuition that the poor person should get healthcare and the billionaire should pay his fucking taxes. So, okay, but intuition isn't very objective, so how do we know what these freestanding rights are? Well, you say, as Robert Nozick does, oh, it's about protecting what's fundamentally human about us. Okay, great, let's protect what's fundamentally human, in which case exclusive control of property is like 112th on the list.
Yes.
So even, you know, I will grant you deontology, I will grant you objectivism, and you're still left exactly where you started, holding an empty sack.
Yeah, and I mean it's really interesting with Nozick. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert. Will he make an appearance in your in the end of your series, by the way? Like,
no, I'm ending it in 1945.
Okay. Well, he's really interesting because he seems to, based on what I know, he does seem to acknowledge the contingencies of, you know, the like the positions in life that people have in regards to, you know, material wealth or anything. He just, from what I understand, it seems that he just finds that state intervention is such a profoundly harmful injustice that even if there are injustices today, it would seem to be that like the state intervention would just be a worse solution, if you could call it that. So
no, not exactly. So
okay.
So here's the thing with Nozick, and I don't know how far we want to go down with this, is he sort of gets tripped up by his own ideological purity. So he says, people have rights, you can't intervene with them, and those rights are essentially property holding rights, right? And no welfare claim can override that. It's just pure deontology, right? But notice what that means. What counts as you owning something? So he follows John Locke and say, if you made something, it's yours, and if you freely traded for something, it's yours, right? That's called justice in transfer. Well, what this means is the entire set of property holdings in actual society are illegitimate. What if your wealth came According to libertarians, right, taxation is theft, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what if your billionaire's wealth, which a lot of them do, comes from government contracts? That's stolen money. Do we not have to give that back?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What if you have a family fortune that goes back to slavery? That's stolen money. You have to give that back.
Mm-hmm.
And once you actually get right down to it, if you consider that any dollar in the economy probably passes through the government, hence is stolen every few years, the entire set of holdings is illegitimate. And Nozick, to his credit, recognizes that and says, and I quote, a one-time distribution of goods along lines of the difference principle may well be warranted. So even at its most pure, libertarianism weirdly leads to redistribution, which Nozick recognizes.
Yeah, he proposed a potential one-time redistribution. Am I right? Like just
Yes.
total. I find that hilarious, and I've brought that up multiple times in arguments, like, you know, just nothing important, but with right wingers. I'm like, yeah, maybe we should just do a one-time redistribution and see where that leaves us. See how the market selects out from the bad actors from there. So I don't know.
I'm guessing you didn't get much traction with it, though.
No, like it's just kind of like blank slate, and you know how arguments go. Like, right. If you don't even like the framing of something, then you just, there are ways to argue that ignores it in a way that doesn't seem like you're ignoring it. So
yeah, I think this goes to one of the great appeals of libertarianism, is that it's very simple. Like, it allows people to feel like they've understood the world. You know, because the world's very complicated, and that's scary. Libertarianism just goes, well, here's all you really need to know. Individual rights, freedom, government bad, market good. And really any new information you get can be made sense of in terms of that. That's very, very appealing.
Yeah, and I think that does segue into some of the things I wanted to maybe go back and forth with you about.
Oh, yeah, please.
Because, you know, a lot, I think that sort of realizing the world makes sense this way with markets, that's a very libertarian phenomenon. Maybe it just appeals to their intuitions, but I don't know. I think libertarianism doesn't account for, you know, non-governmental, like non-formal power structures, like, you know, buying power, corporate power. They think, you know, I'm not exactly strawmanning them when I say the markets are, you know, an ultimate good. I think even a lot of liberalism and even some progressive liberalism seems to not account for those power imbalances, like, you know, like a buying power. Like, maybe I think this is an example you would agree with, so I wouldn't chalk it up to progressive liberalism. But when we're talking about the free exchange that you brought up just a few minutes ago, if you are looking for a job, you're looking to exchange your labor for pay. If you have a job interview and they offer you the job, there's a power imbalance. There's you know, the company has more buying power, because if you turn down that job, they can very easily find somebody else with your qualifications. But you know, if you turn down that job, the consequences are much worse for you. So at that point, you just kind of have to say, well, I guess I'll take this $10 an hour job because of coercion. It's not a free choice, and things like that pop up, or like, I don't have the choice to work at another company that doesn't exploit sweatshop labor overseas. Like, there's no power for you in there, and there's definitely no power that the sweatshop laborers have available to them. And I'm worried, at least my conception of liberalism a few years ago, at least my politics didn't really seem to account for that. and I'm worried that mainstream Democratic Party members and pundits don't account for things like that very well either, you know?
Yeah. So as a side point, I'll just note an example of what I was talking about, which is that politics is the competition for the control of political language. You know, just look at what you've just said. You've said, well, freedom,
Yes.
restraint, whatever. What you're really arguing about with the libertarian there is the meaning of words.
Yes.
Right? Now, I think our meaning of words is more correct. And I'll add even another element, which is you're including in your conception of freedom the operation of imbalances of power,
Yes.
which I think is correct, and libertarians tend not to do. I'll add one more thing, which I've been thinking about a lot recently in the context of American capitalism, which isn't just power, but which is humiliation. And I think that really runs through a lot of our economy, in that, I mean, think about having to go to the job interview and, you know, wear your little suit and tie and say exactly what they want you to say. Think about like the amount of control, even having a job that's, say, good and middle class and well paying, the amount of deference you have to show in that job. Think about, like, have you ever had like your credit card decline on you? It's humiliating, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
And I think there's a strong element of power in our economy that we don't talk about, at least not in a libertarian phrasing. There's also a strong element of domination and humiliation, and people feel humiliated. And I think that's what you see both on the left in so-called identity politics and on the right in terms of some of the rebellions that you're seeing with Trumpism and so on. People feel like they're in a state of continual disrespect. And that's something that libertarianism, or even a lot of centrist philosophies, even a lot of like formalizing like rules or stuff like that, is just very, very ill-equipped to handle, but one that would, but a set of concerns that's immediately apparent to like the early modern mind or the medieval mind.
Yeah, and well, I guess I would. That seems to more tie to. It makes more sense to me intuitively. I guess that's not an absolute argument, but that seems to be more, you know, just an assertion of power over someone. And again, I know there's that language game going on, but, you know, I'm just framing it in terms of ways I'm understanding it. So I don't know. That's just more easily explainable to me.
There's a strong link between power and domination and power and humiliation, right? To not have power is humiliating. And I think that's how a lot of people are feeling. And I think that contributes to sort of the reflexive antagonism towards politics that you see from both the left and the right. But it's something that you don't really get. You don't get a purchase on that aspect of the human experience at all by looking at it from a libertarian lens. And this is, again, another thing that's wrong with libertarianism, is at its heart is a very impoverished, very emaciated conception of what it is to be a human being. Ideologies and politics are, not entirely, but they're not just communications about what a society should do. They're communications about what it is to be a person. And libertarianism at its heart just has that people are rational want fulfillers. And it's both too optimistic, people aren't all that rational, but also far too pessimistic. We're far more than that. That we're not gregarious, that we're not social, that we don't live in community with others, that we don't feel joy and feel pain, indeed, in community with others. And that we don't have darker tendencies too, that we don't desire to dominate and humiliate people, and we don't desire not to be dominated and humiliated in turn. That there's no awareness at all of that in libertarianism or in economic analysis, which I would argue is just another ideology, or even in many forms of liberalism. And as a result, they're very blind to understanding the forces that actually shape our lives and that actually make happy and fulfilled or not.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, it's a good thing I'm not a Marxist, because I think that would get almost no traction. Like, I think that there is that class reductionism and material reductionism there, but I do think like that dominance of power and that desire to compete is very it's very present, and I think you've actually even implied that in your series, like how the notion of markets being valuable, and the competition being valuable, and that economic freedom, mostly for the wealthy, that had to be artificially introduced to human culture rather than organically developed, I suppose.
Oh yeah, and so Americans, we look at countries like the Soviet Union or China or Cuba, who've spent decades trying to do something that seems very futile to us, to try and rebuild society, not just institutionally, but mentally, so there will be a new type of human being. There will be this new communist man or socialist man. And Americans say that's crazy. You can't change human nature. But we changed human nature. Liberals changed human nature, and it was done intentionally.
Yeah, well, you're sounding very radical at this point, because I guess that is part of your transparency, because you do pull from a wide breadth of perspectives. I do wonder, though, you do. I actually should ask. I'm gonna nail this down like maybe 10 minutes before we end. Like, unless you want to keep going, I don't want to keep you though.
If you want to finish a train of thought, I can do a little bit of I mean, I can't do it forever, but I can do a little bit at a time.
Absolutely. Like, I told you we'd stay for an hour, but
I can do an extra 10 or 15 if you need to.
Sounds good. But where would you place yourself? Because I've heard you describe yourself as a liberal, and that makes sense within your perspective, that you've some of your opinions that you've put out, but you definitely aren't afraid to make some of these radical appeals. A lot of them I agree with. So,
well, I mean, the fact that our ideology, by which I mean your mind, including your subconscious mind, was designed, that doesn't necessarily make it wrong. Like, you wouldn't necessarily want to go back to having a pre-modern mind.
Right.
But to answer the question directly, where am I on liberalism versus radicalism?
Yes.
Oh, well, so, I mean, as ever, right, with these things, it depends what the words mean.
Right.
I guess I'll put it this way. There's a lot of policy goals I would favor that seem very radical. So I'm a prison abolitionist. I think we can think ourselves out of the market economy largely, which is not to say I want to have a command economy. A lot of, like, all of the stuff AOC is proposing right now with the Green New Deal, I'm completely behind. I guess where I'm a liberal, and why I say I'm a liberal, is I have a liberal rather than a radical theory of social change. I do view change as, most desirably being an evolution rather than a revolution, if that makes sense. Now, I think radicals get frustrated with that, because in our present environment, that sort of incremental liberalism has been going all too slow, right? And they're frustrated with the slowness of it. And I think understandably and legitimately so. But at its best, as I'm covering in my libertarianism series, you can have a liberalism that's progressive in its theory of change, but is quite revolutionary in its goals. And you saw that in the late 1800s, when liberals really harnessed the power of urbanization and technological change and the nation state to build things like the market economy, which we push back against now, but were definite improvements from the what was coming before that in terms of feudalism, right? So they fundamentally, radically transformed a feudalist society. And then again, in the middle of the 1900s, liberals, as much as, if not more than, socialists, took a radical goal, but an incremental theory of change, and built welfare states and social democratic institutions and had women enter the workforce. And that sort of progressive liberalism is historically what I identify with. And now I find myself torn. I think there's a big divide between liberals and the left, or liberals and socialists, however you want to set it up, right? Whereas I agree more with the socialists on their goals. But I hear people talking about revolution or what they mean. And what's more, I don't think they know what they mean.
Yeah, that is a problem. And, I actually, even though I think of myself as more of a leftist now, like I'm very hesitant. Like I just don't know what to do with revolution. I have no faith that a revolution is going to solve X problem. But I guess I'm also very hesitant, like looking at liberalism, even progressive liberalism now, and hopefully we're speaking the same language, but there's still that corporate power element to it, and I'm worried that something like AOC, a politician like AOC, like if there were a movement to get radical for the Democratic Party going, like I that seems almost reformist to a fault to me, and like even that I feel like the corporate money that helps fund the Democratic Party would just prevent even something that I don't think goes far enough. It would prevent that sort of movement from taking off the ground. And I'm so cynical all the time. And sometimes I just think, we're fucked. Climate change is going to get us no matter what happens. So
that might well be the case. But look, I've been doing my ideological series, right? And if you look at the challenges that were facing Western nations between 1914 and 1945. I mean, for one thing, you have the two world wars, but you also have the Great Depression. You also have the rise of fascism. And I think it's very naive to think that something like, Mussolini or Hitler couldn't have happened here, right? It absolutely could have done. And so you have just these absolute body blows hitting society from every angle, and in a way that's every bit as terrifying and much more immediate than climate change is now, right? And it was in many ways progressive liberalism that led the world out of that said, as Keynes said, we have to find a middle road between reaction and revolution, because we've seen where both those roads end. And in his time, you've seen the forces of reaction, of old school conservatives sticking to their guns, just get swept away in Germany and Italy by fascists. Or in Russia, you saw the dangers of revolution. Now, those dangers aren't as real to us, but I think that's what we have to go here. And we see all too clearly the dangers of reaction today, right? But the dangers of revolution are a bit more subtle, but they're still there. Look at the 2016 election, where people like Susan Sarandon says, I'm not voting because Trump's more likely to bring on the revolution. Well, where is it? And I think there's a danger to thinking this deus ex machina revolution thing is just going to descend from the sky with no effort on our part. And I'll be honest with you, when I look at the contemporary far left, I do not see people who are ready to fight a violent revolution.
Yeah. Well, also we lack the numbers too.
I see anything but. And again, I go back to Keynes. He says, when you are in that situation of existential threat, and where there don't seem to be good options on the table, the more rational question just becomes, which are your most probable options. So if we only have a 10% chance of AOC's Green New Deal getting passed and upheld, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that a better or worse chance than our chances of revolution? I assume it would be better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, you know, a lot of leftists would disagree with you. I'm kind of agnostic on the what if question, if I'm going to be honest, but that's just because I'm so pessimistic. So,
but it's weird though, because like we have this incredible pessimism about
yes,
what's possible institutionally, and then this incredible optimism that we can fight the American army.
mm-hmm. Yeah,
something doesn't jive there, right?
Right. Well, it's easy to make fun of libertarians for, you know, their gun rights. They want gun rights to defend against a tyrannical government, and it's like, you know, what are you going to do against drone strikes? You know, there's nothing you can do. And like, I think progressive liberals are right to make that snark. But like leftism doesn't seem to have an answer for that one. So I don't know.
No, and you know, the conservative mouth breathers who talk about, you know, government tyranny will at least have shotguns in their hand when they're vaporized by government drones.
Yep.
What's our plan? And I don't, by and large, when I talk to people on the far left, I don't see people who are ready to die for it. But let me just close with this. I think we have a problem. So I'll defend radical conclusions, but I absolutely am 2 feet in the camp of a progressive rather than a revolutionary theory of change. And let me put it to you this way. I think we compare apples to oranges. We compare a progressive theory of change as it is now in the real world with all of its failings to a revolutionary theory of change that exists in an abstract best case scenario world only in our imagination, right? So let's compare apples to apples. Let's either consider a hypothetical perfected theory of progressive change in comparison to your hypothetical revolution, or let's consider revolution as it is, and let's consider progressivism as it is. As it is, revolutions kill the old, the poor, and the vulnerable. That's it. They almost never achieve anything of lasting value. And even when they do, in cases like the US Revolution, there are very, very dark overhangs to them, i.e. slavery and the extermination of Native Americans, right? You cannot point me to an unambiguously morally good revolution, or I don't think you can. And sometimes they just end in complete tragedy, i.e. the Russian Revolution, and retard the progress of mankind for a century. Whereas, does progressivism often fail? Yes. Does it sometimes fail badly? Yes, but look at what it's done, even in America, within living memory. It, by the New Deal and by that transformation of our society, allowed us to get through economic crisis, war, and the rise of fascism with a democracy. That's no mean feat. After that happened, it allowed the single greatest societal integration of an oppressed racial minority within a generation or so. As imperfect and as flawed and as incomplete as that is, the civil rights was a remarkable achievement. It's unparalleled in any other Western democracy. That was achieved by incrementalism. Yes, people protested and there was direct action and so on, but no one was talking about shooting the president.
Yeah, well, I guess.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll call you out. Well, I mean, that by many people's standards, including I think leftists, I think that is a lot of radical action. And again, this is down to the language game. But you know, MLK was a socialist, and he wanted strong. You know, he wanted strong redistribution. Malcolm X even more so, more strongly. And I think, you know, I would not call Malcolm X, like, you can't wash him over with reformism in any sense of the word. And well, by my standard, and I think he helped that movement quite a bit, or at least his sub community.
Right. But that threat of the far radical has always been what progressives at their best use. And I think we have a very impoverished conception of what progressive change is, as just like showing up and voting and nothing else. No, anything and everything is on the table, short of really like where we bomb the Capitol, you know, right? But that threat of the scary radical is, look, the people who built the Green New Deal were saying, you really think that what happened in the Soviet Union can't happen here? Let's do a little bit of socialism so we don't have to do a lot. What happened in the Civil Rights Act was MLK very strategically used radicals like Malcolm and people even further out than him to say, look, would you rather be look, Mr. Lyndon Johnson, would you rather be negotiating with me or him? Because I don't like that choice, but that is the choice that faces you. So no, weaponizing and utilizing that fear has always been a core and its best. The radical and the progressive are two fists punching together, and they're aware that they're doing that as part of a coordinating strategy.
Yeah, well, it's kind of good cop, bad cop, though. The left doesn't like cops, so I'll probably have to come up with another. I'll come up with another analogy for that. And yeah, and we are coming up on time, so I'll let you go and let you. I'll say thanks for the capitalist swine propaganda reformism. But no, like, you know, I could push back. I don't think I'm equipped, but I think this was very helpful, and it helped me know where you're coming from. I almost think of you as a lot more radical now, which is interesting. I don't know where I place myself.
What, spiel on the merits of incrementalism.
Well, the fact that you think we can get out of market economies, and you do have an economics degree, right?
Yeah, so. PPE, politics, philosophy, economics.
Okay.
I mean, look, in one sentence, here's the deal. Were market economies an improvement over what came before? Absolutely. Is there a moral consequentialist argument for markets based on improvements of living? Absolutely. Does that mean that we can't imagine better still economic systems? Of course we can. And if that sounds too incrementalist or too centrist for you, I just say that is almost exactly down to the letter Karl Marx's position.
Yeah, no, he did think capitalism was sort of a phase change that improved on feudalism, as I recall. So yeah. Anyway, since I'm talking to the number 20 political philosophy podcaster on Twitter, your plugs probably won't get very much mileage, but you should plug your stuff and your handle and everything before you take off. But thank you for coming on.
Oh no worries. I've enjoyed doing it. It's nice. I'm always asking other people about their views, so it's nice to be asked to really cash out mine in detail. Yeah, if you want to check out my stuff, just Google Political Philosophy Podcast, and it's the first thing that comes up. And yeah, there's a Twitter. I mean, I'm increasingly tweeting, which I think is probably a bad habit. And yeah, there's a bunch of ways you can follow us. Just it's politicalphilosophypodcast.com, or if you Google Political Philosophy Podcast, it's the first thing that comes up, and there's a bunch of ways you can follow.
Yeah, it's your podcast is exactly what it says on the tin too. So it's a great name for it. I did chuckle to myself when I saw Mandisa share she was on this. I'm like, oh, the Political Philosophy Podcast. Okay.
Yeah, I don't think I've ever decided if it's the or it's just Political Philosophy Podcast. But yes.
Okay. Well, I've taken enough of your time. Thank you so much. I look forward to the rest of the series, and people should definitely check out your work. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
All right. I'll close the Hangout.